Hi. Another of the frequently asked questions on introductory training courses in solution focus is the question, what do you do when what the client wants is impossible? It's an interesting question. And one of the interesting things about it is how often it's asked compared with how infrequently this actually happens in therapy, in working with people. And I guess, maybe, that one of the reasons that the question is so often asked is probably to do with a real anxiety about actually asking clients, in effect, what do you want from this? What are your best hopes from our talking together? It's quite an unusual thing to do. Most approaches to therapy don't do that. They start from an expert position of assuming that the worker should know the focus, the direction of the work, and it's based on a professional assessment of some sort. So asking the client is unusual. And perhaps in some senses, it represents, one of the last little reflections, if you like, of a predominant problem-focused way of thinking, within which, in essence, clients can't really be trusted. Do we really listen and take seriously what clients are saying? Clients within problem-focused models are often assumed not to really want to change. They want to keep things the same. They're resistant at some level. And so the act of accepting, of trusting the client to know, is both a radical one and it's a position that is a little discomforting. You could say that it's discomforting. And so it's hardly surprising that people are led to ask, frequently, what happens when what the client wants is impossible? Now, I think in terms of thinking about that, we need to go back to the question that we actually ask. And the question that we ask at Brief is, so what are your best hopes from our talking together? What are your best hopes from our talking together? And there's two things that are crucial in the structure of this. We're asking about people's hopes. And of course, a hope is actually defined in terms of something that could actually happen. You can't hope for something that's impossible. You can want something that's impossible. You could love to have something that's impossible, but you can't hope for something that's impossible. And the second part of the question, of course, is from our talking together. So this is something that the client can hope for, therefore it's possible, and could arise from our talking together. There really are two parts to this. So were the client to answer that question by saying, I'd have my arm back, a client who's suffered a distressing and painful amputation. Actually, that is a curious response to the question, what are your best hopes, remember the word hope, from our talking together? To say, I would want my arm back, to say the only thing that would make a difference to me would be having my partner back, either as a result of a painful separation or indeed as a result of a bereavement, would be a curious answer. For a child to say, for my parents to be back together, when the therapist is working individually with the child, would equally be a strange answer to that question, to the extent that, although perhaps it might be possible, how would it happen from our talking together? So those sorts of answers are in themselves strange. And we could say that they are not an answer to the question. We could frame them that way. We could take the view that those answers are and could be thought of as a cry of pain, a cry of torment, a cry of anguish, and should be best responded to as such. And therefore, the pain would be acknowledged. Goodness, it sounds like things really have been tough for you. Something that says, I've heard that anguish, I've heard that pain. And then, of course, if we assume that the client has not answered the question, they haven't answered the question, what are your best hopes? They might have answered the question, what do you want, but not what are your best hopes? We could repeat the question. So the client says, I want my partner back. And we could respond by saying, sure, of course. So what are your best hopes from our talking together? The implication, of course, is that the question has not yet been answered, and so we repeat it. Steve DeShazer tells a story, and I've been hunting for it this morning and have not found it, where he asks a miracle question. And the client responds by wanting something that is indeed impossible. My recollection is that this was an amputee who wanted their lost limb back. And Steve just waits. And having waited, the client says, so you meant a miracle that could really happen. Again, Steve's waiting is the equivalent of re-asking the question. His view always was that until I take my turn in a conversation, it remains the client's turn. So his waiting and my re-asking could well be the same. However, an alternative, of course, is to take the view that the client has answered the question and to build from that answer. So I ask, what are your best hopes from our talking together? And the client answers, the only thing that would make a difference to me would be if my partner were back. And so if I assume that that is indeed an answer to the question, I can say, sure, of course. And if you were to have your partner back, what difference are you hoping that that would make? And the client might answer, indeed, clients have answered, by saying, I'd have a life again. And so at that point, we can check it out. So if we were to do some talking, and as a result of the talking, or after the talking, at the end of that talking, you realized that you had a life again, would that make this useful? And the client says yes. And so we can invite them to imagine you wake up tomorrow morning and you do indeed have a life again, a life that's just right for you and just right for your future. What's the very first thing that we would notice, that you would notice, that would tell you that you have that life again? So, of course, it's an obvious question to ask. What do you do when people want impossible things. Actually, it happens very rarely. And in fact, it is relatively straightforward to know how to respond to such responses.